They say a man's strength is measured by what he can hold on to. His fortune, his family, his good name. They say a man is strong if he can build himself a kingdom, piece by careful piece, and then defend it against all comers. We see those men, don't we? Standing tall, shoulders back, a quiet pride in their eyes. And we think there's a man who's made it. But I reckon that's only half the truth. The real measure, the one that digs deep into your bones and rattles your soul, the one that echoes long after the fancy talk fades, is what happens when all that's stripped away. When the hands that once clutched tight are left empty, and the ground beneath your feet crumbles to dust. When the good name you built is smeared with mud, and the kingdom you called your own is nothing but rubble. That's when you find out what you're truly made of. That's when you discover the kind of strength that doesn't just hold on, but stands up when there's nothing left to grab. That's when you meet a man like Hank. Hank was a man forged in the heat of 100 summers and the bite of 100 winters. 48 years old, his life etched onto his face like the grain on old timber. He wasn't a talker, never had been much for unnecessary words, though he'd listen good, soaking up everything like dry earth. You'd find him mostly on a job site, the kind of place where sweat stained concrete and steel hummed with a purpose he understood. A construction worker, same as he'd been since he was barely out of school, hauling lumber, laying rebar, swinging a hammer with the kind of practiced ease that only comes from decades of honest effort. His hands, gnarled and thick-knuckled, told their own story without him ever opening his mouth. They were the hands of a man who knew the feel of a hammer, a saw, a shovel better than he knew the feel of a soft pillow. Calloused, scarred, strong as oak, they were his tools and his testament, proof of every hard-earned dollar and every long day under the sun. They moved with a quiet efficiency, never wasted, always deliberate, whether he was tightening a bolt or picking up a dropped nail. They moved like they remembered the weight of work, a lifetime of it, ingrained in every fiber. His eyes, though, were what really got you. Deep set, the color of faded denim, they held a quiet kind of watchfulness, like he'd seen things that didn't need talking about and had decided long ago that words just complicated matters. You wouldn't call them sad, not exactly. More like they'd witnessed too much, endured too much, and now just observed the world with a patient, unyielding resolve. There were lines fanning out from the corners, not just from squinting against the sun, but from a lifetime of careful observation, of carrying burdens, of not letting anything show on the surface. There was a stoicism about him, a bit gruff, that kept most folks at a distance, preferring his own company or the silent camaraderie of men working shoulder to shoulder. He was the kind of man who'd offer a nod instead of a greeting, a grunt instead of a conversation. But if you looked close enough, past the tired lines and the quiet reserve, you could see the faintest flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe just the sheer stubbornness of a man who refused to break, no matter what the world threw at him. He moved with a heavy, steady gait, like a man who understood the weight of the ground beneath him and the weight of what he carried inside. He was Hank and he was still standing. He was Hank and he was still standing. Folks, you hear stories about strength. They talk about iron wills, unyielding spirits. But I tell you, real strength, it ain't just about holding on when the world tries to rip you apart. Sometimes it's about what you do after it's already been ripped away, piece by painful piece, leaving you with nothing but dust and echoes. It's about finding out what you're made of when everything you thought defined you is gone, like smoke on the wind. There was a man, a good man, who learned this truth the hardest way there is. That man was Hank. 48 years old, though some days, looking at the road map of lines on his face, you'd swear he'd seen 80. He worked construction, same as he always had, swinging a hammer or running a backhoe, building things up only to watch them, sometimes, get torn down again. You'd see him. On a crew, always the first to show up, the last to leave. His face, weathered by sun and wind and too many long years, held the kind of stoicism that only comes from staring down hardship and not blinking. His hands, though, they were the real story. Knuckles thick and scarred, skin like old leather, each line and callus a testament to a life spent building, repairing, and holding on. They were the hands of a working man, plain and simple, and right now, they were his entire world. His mornings started before the sun even thought about making an appearance. 5 a.m., the cheap plastic alarm clock by his bed would whine its tinny tune, dragging him from the shallow sleep that was all he seemed to manage these days. No gentle easing into the day for Hank. It was an instant jolt, a mental kick in the gut, reminding him that another day had arrived, demanding to be lived. He'd swing his legs over the side of the bed, the old springs groaning a complaint that matched his own silent one, and plant his feet on the cool linoleum. The house was small, a single-story place in a neighborhood where every home looked like it had seen its fair share of good times and bad. Meticulously kept, despite its age, it was a quiet rebellion against the chaos that had once consumed his life. A pot of coffee, bitter and strong, was always the first order of business, followed by 2 pieces of toast, eaten standing by the kitchen counter, no butter, no jam, just fuel. Then it was into the worn Carhartts, the scuffed work boots, and out the door before the first streaks of orange painted the eastern sky. He drove his beat-up Ford F-150, a loyal companion through better years and worse, to whatever job site the foreman had him on that week. Could be a new subdivision going up, all fresh lumber and the promise of families. Could be tearing down an old warehouse, making way for something new. The work was honest. It was hard. And it paid just enough to keep the wolf from the door, but not much more. Every bill that came in, the electric, the water, the ever-present mortgage on the house that felt too big for just one man, was a fresh punch to the gut. He'd sit at the kitchen table late at night, a dull pencil moving over faded statements, trying to stretch every dollar, every dime until it screamed. There were no more comfortable margins, no contingency funds, no cushion. Just the raw, exposed nerves of living paycheck to paycheck. A stark contrast to the days when his own business had thrived, when his name meant something more than just another guy on the crew. When the sun beat down, or the rain turned the ground to mud, or the frost bit at his fingers, Hank just kept moving. He found a strange, grim comfort in the physical labor, the sheer exhaustion that, if he was lucky, would allow him a few hours of dreamless sleep. But even the sweat and the ache in his bones couldn't always drown out the other noise, the kind that lived deep inside his head. It was the quiet moments that truly killed him. The drone of a backhoe could sometimes sound like a child's laughter carried on the wind, sharp and sudden, twisting the knife that already lived in his chest. A scent, maybe freshly cut grass, would conjure an image of Sarah tending their small backyard garden, humming a tune he couldn't quite recall. Emily, always Emily. Her bright, curious eyes, her tiny hand trustingly placed in his. He'd see them so vivid they felt real enough to touch, only for them to dissolve like smoke, leaving him with a hollow ache that was worse than any physical pain. He used to be a man with plans, with dreams bigger than the next day's shift. He'd built his business from the ground up, a testament to his ambition and skill. He'd imagined expanding, building a legacy for Emily, providing Sarah with everything she ever deserved. He'd worn his good name like a finely tailored suit, proud and confident. Now he was just Hank the grunt, the guy who showed up. The gap between the man he was and the man he'd wanted to be was a chasm, wide and black and filled with the ghosts of what he'd lost. Sometimes a flicker of that old fire would spark. He'd look at a blueprint, and for a second he wouldn't just see beams and concrete, but the intricate dance of engineering, the potential. He'd remember the satisfaction of taking a raw piece of land and molding it into something beautiful, something functional. But then the flicker would die, snuffed out by the cold reality of his current station. He wasn't the boss anymore. He didn't make the decisions. He just followed orders, moving earth, laying pipe, pouring concrete. He was a cog, not the engine. The shame of it, that was the real inner demon. Not just the loss of his family, that was grief, a different beast entirely. But the loss of his standing, his fortune, his reputation. He'd been the man people looked up to, the one who had it all. And then he'd had nothing. He'd alienated friends, pushed away well-meaning relatives, his stubborn pride refusing any offers of charity or help. He'd internalized it all, burying the pain under layers of gruff silence and relentless work. He didn't want anyone to see the broken man underneath, the one who still woke up some nights, gasping, reaching for a hand that wasn't there, a future that had vanished. He just wanted to keep moving, keep working, keep earning, hoping that one day the ghosts might finally let him be. He longed for purpose beyond just existing, but every day felt like an endless loop, a treadmill to nowhere. He was tired, bone-deep tired, but sleep offered no real escape. So he kept going because what else was there? And then one Tuesday, the world stopped spinning. It was a clear autumn day, crisp and bright, the kind Sarah loved. Hank was on a job site arguing with a supplier about a delayed concrete delivery when his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost let it go to voicemail. He wished he had. The voice on the other end was too calm, too professional for the words it spoke. An accident, a drunk driver, a minivan, Sarah, Emily. The world tilted, then shattered. He remembered dropping the phone, the clatter on the dusty ground, the distant roar of a bulldozer suddenly sounding like a banshee's wail. His foreman found him crumpled beside a stack of lumber, staring at nothing, a silent scream trapped in his throat. The days that followed were a blur of unimaginable pain. The smell of lilies, the hollow echo of the eulogy, the unbearable weight of the small white casket, the even smaller pink one. He walked through it all like a ghost, his hands clenching and unclenching, trying to grasp what wasn't there. Emily's tiny sneakers by the door, Sarah's gardening gloves on the porch swing. Every corner of the house screamed their absence. The silence, oh God, the silence was a physical thing, pressing down, suffocating him. He moved from room to room, touching their things, memorizing the absence, the spaces they no longer filled. He just sat, sometimes for hours, in Emily's bright, animal-themed room, staring at the empty bed, the unfinished drawing on her tiny desk. He could still hear her laughter, a phantom echo, and sometimes he swore he could smell Sarah's perfume. While he was buried in that bottomless grief, the world kept turning, and his business, starved of his attention, began to unravel. He'd always prided himself on his hands-on approach, his meticulous oversight. But now, oversight was a luxury he couldn't afford. Calls from the bank piled up unanswered. Bad investments he'd made years ago, minor at the time, now festered, exacerbated by market shifts and his own inability to focus. A large payment for a project he'd completed was delayed indefinitely by a bankrupt client. Suppliers, sensing trouble, started demanding cash up front. Then the subcontractors owed money started walking away. The phone, once a lifeline for his thriving business, now rang with the persistent, ominous tone of creditors and lawyers. He distrusted the wrong people, made assumptions, let his grief blind him to the impending financial ruin. One afternoon, a letter arrived, thick and formal, sealing the fate of Hank's construction. Foreclosure. Liquidation. His good name, once solid as bedrock, now smeared with whispers of incompetence and failure. He remembered standing in the empty office, the stripped walls echoing his own hollowness. The framed photos of completed projects, once sources of immense pride, now felt like cruel jokes. He saw the faces of his employees, good men he'd had to let go, their silent accusations cutting deeper than any yelled word. He'd lost his family, then he lost the very thing he'd built to provide for them. He had nothing left but the faded denim on his back and the calluses on his hands, useless now, or so it felt. The man Hank had been was gone, buried under a landslide of loss and disgrace. The night he signed the final papers, surrendering everything, he drove home in a daze. The small house felt even emptier, if such a thing were possible. The air itself seemed heavy with defeat. He walked straight through to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and just stood there, staring at the silent refrigerator. No child's drawings taped to the door, no magnet collection from family vacations, just the dull gleam of stainless steel reflecting his own haunted eyes. It was 3 a.m. The house was a tomb. The only sound was the faint hum of the old fridge and the frantic, incessant thumping of his own heart. He sat at the kitchen table, the chipped formica cool beneath his forearms. He hadn't lit a single light. The faint glow from a distant street lamp filtered through the blinds, casting long, accusing shadows across the floor. He hadn't slept properly in months, not since. Not since. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the flash of headlights, heard the screech of tires. Or he'd feel the ghost of Emily's hand in his, and the sharp, sudden pain of knowing it wasn't real would tear him awake. He picked up a crumpled utility bill, smoothed it out, then let it drop. It was just another piece of paper, another reminder of the life he no longer had. The life he had squandered let slip through his fingers. He looked at his hands, those strong, capable hands that had built so much, fixed so much, held so much. Now they felt useless, trembling slightly. "What good are you now, Hank?" he whispered into the oppressive silence. His voice was raspy, unfamiliar. He leaned back in the creaking chair, staring up at the dark ceiling. He saw Sarah's face, smiling, teasing him about leaving his work boots by the door. He saw Emily, all giggles and scraped knees, demanding a piggyback ride. The images were so vivid they brought a fresh wave of agony. They were gone, and he was here, alone. He was a shell, a ghost haunting his own life. The proud man, the successful businessman, the loving husband and father, all dead, all buried. What was left? A tired, broken man, riddled with debt and shame, working a job that paid just enough to keep the lights on and the creditors at bay. He had nowhere to go, no one to talk to. His stubborn pride had seen to that, pushing away any hand that tried to reach for him. He was truly, utterly alone. The silence pressed down, squeezing the air from his lungs. There was nothing, absolutely nothing. Just the deep, cold pit of despair staring back at him from the darkness. He felt it settle in his bones, an uninvited, permanent resident. This wasn't just grief, this was absolute existential ruin. Every fiber of his being screamed that he was finished, done, worthless. He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing he could just disappear. But even that was too much effort. He just sat there, waiting for the sun to rise, knowing it would bring no warmth, no comfort, only another day of trudging through the wreckage of his life. The silence in Hank's small house had become a physical presence, a heavy shroud since Sarah and Emily left him. But there was another silence, colder, sharper, that had been creeping up on him for months, like winter frost. It was the silence in the office, the one that used to hum with phones ringing, invoices rustling, the low murmur of men discussing blueprints. That silence had been a slow bleed, but the final, gut-wrenching moment arrived on a Tuesday late afternoon when the last remaining shreds of his old life were torn away. He sat at his desk, the same scarred oak desk where he'd signed the papers for his first big loan, where Emily had once drawn him a lopsided picture of a house with a purple roof. Now there was just one envelope. Certified mail. He knew what it was. He'd known it was coming for weeks, ever since the bank manager's voice had grown colder than the winter wind. Ever since that last big client had defaulted, vanishing like smoke, taking Hank's future with them. His grief had made him careless, vulnerable. He'd made bad calls, trusting the wrong people, trying to plug holes in a dam that was already cracking, all while his heart was screaming with an unhealable wound. He'd borrowed against things he shouldn't have, extended credit he couldn't cover. His reputation, once solid as reinforced concrete, had begun to crumble, whispered about at supply yards, eyed with suspicion at job sites. Hank, reliable Hank, had become Hank the Risk. His fingers, thick and calloused from years of gripping hammers and wrenches, fumbled with the edge of the envelope. It felt impossibly heavy, a lead coffin for his dreams. The paper rustled with a sound like dry leaves, each crackle a tiny accusation. Inside, a single sheet. The typeface was stark, unforgiving. Notice of foreclosure. Not just the business property, but the remaining assets, too. The trucks, the equipment, even the small parcel of land he'd been saving for Emily's future, a place she could build her own purple-roofed house one day. All of it, gone, every last stick and stone. He read the words, but they didn't penetrate at first. It was like watching a movie with the sound off. Knew what they meant, but the meaning felt distant, a problem for someone else. Then slowly the cold seeped in. It wasn't just the business, it was his name. His word, his entire identity. Everything he'd built brick by brick, decade by decade, was being dismantled, not by his own hands, but by the cold, impersonal machinery of debt and law. The small-town pride he'd worn like a comfortable coat was now shredded, scattered by the wind. People would talk. They already were. He could almost hear the whispers, the clucking tongues in the diner, the knowing glances at the lumberyard. Poor Hank! But you know he just wasn't on top of things after. Well, you know. The pity was a poison, worse than the contempt. He slowly folded the paper, the crisp edges biting into his thumb. His eyes scanned the empty office one last time. The dust motes danced in the fading sunlight, illuminated by the dying day. The faint smell of sawdust and stale coffee hung in the air, ghosts of a busy past. There was nothing left to fight for here. No more projects to bid, no more crews to manage, no more future to plan. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the worn linoleum, a sound that echoed in the cavernous silence. He walked over to the window, looking out at the parking lot where his trucks used to gleam, lined up like soldiers. Now it was just his beat-up pickup looking smaller, lonelier than ever. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, but Hank felt no warmth, only an immense aching cold. The crack wasn't just in his business, it was in his very foundation, his soul. He was hollowed out, a structure condemned, waiting for the final wrecking ball. He thought he'd lost everything when Sarah and Emily died. He was wrong. He still had his name, his business, his perceived strength. Now that too was gone. The notice sat on the kitchen counter, a pale, ominous rectangle against the dim light cast by the street lamp outside. Hank didn't need to look at it. He'd memorized every cold, hard line, every legal phrase that signified the end. The house itself felt colder now, knowing it was likely next. He'd been through the day in a fog, mechanically going through the motions at his laborer job, lifting beams, digging trenches, his mind a blank, his body just muscle memory. But now it was 3 a.m. again, the witching hour, and the fog had lifted, leaving him naked to the cruel clarity of his situation. He was back in his worn armchair, the same one he'd been in just hours before, it seemed, when the last batch of despair had settled in. But this was different. This wasn't just the grief, the haunting memories. This was the full, unvarnished truth staring him down, reflecting in the scratched surface of the old coffee table. He was a pauper, a failure. A man whose name was now synonymous with ruin. Not just a grieving widower, but a disgraced businessman. The two losses intertwined now, a Gordian knot of pain and shame. His throat felt raw tight. He hadn't eaten anything substantial in days, just picked at whatever meager meal he could stomach. His stomach was a hollow pit, not just from hunger, but from a deeper, more profound emptiness. He rubbed his temples, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. He hadn't shaved in days. What was the point? Who was he trying to impress? Himself. The man in the mirror was a stranger, gaunt and broken, with eyes that held the weight of too many sorrows. He'd always prided himself on being a self-made man, started with nothing, built a successful company, provided well for his family. That was his story. That was his identity. Now that story was ash. There was no company, no family, no pride. Just the meager wages from a construction gig, just enough to barely keep the wolves from the door for another week, maybe two. And the creditors would be calling again soon. He could picture the red letter envelopes, the terse phone calls. He had nothing to say to them, nothing to offer. A profound weariness settled over him, deeper than any physical exhaustion from a long day on the site. It was a bone-deep weariness of the soul. He'd spent his life building, always looking forward. Now there was nothing to build and no future to look to. Every path he saw led to a dead end. Every memory, once a source of comfort, was now a fresh wound, a reminder of what he had and what he'd lost. He thought about Sarah, about Emily. Would they be ashamed of him? The thought twisted his gut, a fresh wave of self-loathing. He had failed them. He had failed himself. He closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his eyelids was no escape. It was filled with the stark black and white images of the foreclosure notice, overlaid with the laughing faces of his wife and daughter. The contrast was unbearable. He was trapped between a past he couldn't retrieve and a future he could fathom. His chest ached, a dull, constant throb. He wanted to scream, to rage, to smash something, anything, but he could. The energy for such a primal release was gone, drained from him like water from a cracked cistern. There was only this crushing, silent weight, this acknowledgement of absolute existential ruin. He had hit bottom. There was no more down to go, just the hard, cold ground. He was truly, utterly, completely lost. The final brick of his old life had fallen. He just sat there, breathing in the stale air, tasting the dust of his shattered world. Then, just as the last echoes of his broken world faded into a hollow silence, something shifted. It wasn't a grand epiphany, no lightning bolt of divine inspiration. It was far quieter, far more fundamental. It was the absolute, unyielding truth of a man who had hit bedrock. There was no more give, no more space to fall. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the stale air filling his lungs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a flicker of something other than despair. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was a cold, hard clarity. This wasn't living. This was simply existing, a slow, agonizing decay, and a quiet, unshakable voice buried deep beneath the rubble of his life whispered, "Enough!" It wasn't an enough of surrender, but an enough of stagnation, an enough of letting the current drag him further down. He didn't know what lay ahead, didn't have a map or a plan. The future was still a vast, terrifying blank. But he knew with a certainty that reached his bones that he would not continue this way. Grief would remain a permanent scar. The loss was absolute, but he refused to be defined solely by the things that had been taken from him. He had two hands. He had a pulse. He was still here. That was the only truth that mattered in that moment. The alarm clock blared at 5 a.m. the next morning, just as it always had. For months, he'd either slapped it silent and rolled over or simply gotten up to sit in the kitchen's dim light, staring at nothing. Today, though, was different. A faint tremor of resistance ran through him, a ghost of the old inertia, but the quiet enough from the night before had planted a seed. He pushed himself upright. His back protested, his joints ached, but he swung his legs over the side of the bed. One foot on the floor, then the other, small victories. He went through the motions, a quiet ritual honed over decades. Shower, shave, strong black coffee. Each act was deliberate, almost meditative. Dressed in clean, if faded, work clothes, heavy jeans, a plaid shirt, steel-toed boots. He didn't know where he was going or what he was going to do, but he knew he couldn't stay in that house. Not another day of staring at the walls, at the ghosts that lived in every corner. He walked out the front door, the early morning air cool on his face, carrying a lunch he'd packed, a simple sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water. His old truck, though scuffed and aged, started with a familiar rumble. He turned the key, the engine caught, and he drove. He didn't have a job lined up. He hadn't made a single call. All he had was a direction, downtown towards the industrial park where day laborers often gathered, waiting for a chance. The thought of it, of standing shoulder to shoulder with men he might once have hired, burned with a bitter pride. But the enough was stronger than the pride. He parked on the edge of the lot, away from the knot of men already congregating. He watched them for a while, a lump forming in his throat. This wasn't the Hank Miller who used to oversee crews, who managed bids. This was just Hank, another pair of hands looking for a day's wages. He took another deep breath, forced down the knot of shame, and stepped out of the truck. The foreman, a burly man with a chipped tooth and a tired smile, recognized the silent determination in Hank's eyes, even if he didn't know his story. "Need a pair of hands for demo, old-timer." He grunted, gesturing to a beat-up pickup piled high with tools. Hank simply nodded. "Yes, sir." His voice was a little rough, unused. He spent the next 8 hours swinging a sledgehammer, tearing down a crumbling brick wall. The work was brutal, relentless. His muscles, softened by months of inaction, screamed in protest. Dust coated his lungs, grit worked its way into his pores, and sweat stung his eyes. Every swing was a test, a battle against his own exhaustion, against the gnawing doubt that whispered he was too old, too broken for this. He wanted to quit. God, he wanted to just drop the hammer and walk away, retreat to the quiet despair of his empty house. But with each shattering blow against the mortar, something else happened. The physical pain, raw and immediate, began to drown out the deeper, more insidious pain of his grief and shame. His mind, for the first time in ages, was focused entirely on the task at hand. The rhythm of the work, the sheer effort of it, demanded all his attention. When the sun finally began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Hank stood amidst the rubble, covered in dust and sweat, his body aching in places he hadn't known existed. The wall was down. A small pile of cash, his wages for the day, was tucked into his pocket. It wasn't much. It wouldn't make a dent in the debts, but as he wiped a grimy hand across his face, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Not happiness, not relief, but a quiet, profound exhaustion that was clean, honest. He had worked, he had endured, and he had, against all odds, shown up for himself. It was a start, a small, almost imperceptible start, but a start nonetheless, the first brick of a new foundation. The next morning, the exhaustion wasn't clean anymore. It was a dull, throbbing ache that settled deep in his bones, making every joint protest the indignity of movement. His eyelids felt like sandpaper, glued shut against the unwelcome intrusion of a new day. For a long minute, he lay there, staring at the ceiling of his modest bedroom, the same ceiling he'd painted with Sarah, the same room where Emily used to tumble in for morning cuddles. The thought of getting up, of facing another day of grunt work, of feeling that relentless burn in his muscles was almost unbearable. He could just stay here, pull the worn blanket up to his chin, and let the world forget about Hank. Let the debts pile higher, let the shame consume him entirely. It would be easier. God, it would be so much easier. But then a flicker, not a spark, not a flame, just a tiny, persistent ember deep within. A stubborn, mulish refusal to surrender completely. He hadn't asked for this, didn't want it, but something in him couldn't just lie down and die. Not yet. With a grunt, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, the mattress groaning in complaint. His back screamed. His arms felt like dead weights. He moved like an old man, each step a deliberate, painful act of will. He made coffee, black and strong, the only comfort he allowed himself. The first sip was a jolt, a silent promise to himself that he would not break. He showed up again. And again. The days blurred into a grueling rhythm. 5 a.m. alarm, the ritual of coffee, and the quiet wrestle with his protesting body. The drive to the site, the foreman's terse nod, the familiar, unforgiving weight of the hammer in his hand. More walls to demolish, more debris to clear, more concrete to mix, more lumber to haul. His hands, once firm and precise in the delicate craft of his own business, were now calloused, perpetually grimy, and often bleeding from small nicks and scrapes. He didn't wear gloves, felt like cheating somehow, like he wasn't earning the pain. Each evening he'd drag himself home, eat a can of soup or a cheap sandwich, too tired to cook. The house, always quiet, felt even emptier then. He'd sit on the porch, watching the last light fade, the silence a heavy shroud. Memories, like ghosts, would drift through the edges of his mind. Sarah's laughter, Emily's bright chatter, the easy comfort of a life he no longer owned. The shame would try to crawl back then, whispering about his failures, his foolish pride, the business he'd let slip through his fingers. He'd clench his jaw, tighten his fists, and focus on the ache in his body until it drowned out the deeper ache in his soul. Physical pain, he was learning, was a powerful anesthetic for the spirit. Around the second week, the grind threatened to break him. He was on a particularly nasty job, tearing out an old, stubborn concrete foundation. The jackhammer rattled his teeth, sending vibrations deep into his already protesting bones. Dust hung thick in the air, caking his throat, stinging his eyes. Every swing felt heavier, every impact weaker. He hit a patch of rebar unforeseen, and the hammer bucked, wrenching his shoulder. A sharp pain shot down his arm, making him drop the tool with a clatter. He stood there, chest heaving, the air thick with exhaust and concrete dust. His shoulder burned, his head pounded, and a wave of nausea rolled over him. He felt utterly, completely spent. "That's it," a voice inside him hissed. "You're done, Hank. You can't do this. You're too old, too broken. Go home, give up, just stop fighting." He looked at the half-demolished concrete slab, then at the foreman, a younger man with eyes that saw too much, already glancing his way. He thought of the small pile of crumpled bills in his wallet, the rent due in a few days, the mounting medical bills from the accident that never seemed to stop arriving. He thought of Sarah, of Emily, of the life he'd promised them. He thought of the man he used to be, full of bluster and certainty, and the hollow shell he'd become. This wasn't about money anymore, not really. It was about proving just to himself that he wasn't entirely worthless. That something of the old Hank, the man who finished what he started, still existed. He bent down, wincing, and picked up the jackhammer. The vibrations sent fresh jolts of pain through his shoulder, but he held it tight. He looked at the concrete, then at his hands, calloused and torn. He wouldn't ask for help. He wouldn't show weakness. Not here. Not now. Gritting his teeth, he leaned into the machine, the roar of the engine a defiant scream against the quiet despair in his heart. He worked slower, each plunge of the drill a conscious act of will, a small victory against the pain and the doubt. His body was a wreck, but his spirit, bruised and battered, refused to yield. He wouldn't quit. He couldn't. Not until the job was done. The next morning, getting out of bed felt like peeling himself off a sticky, razor-sharp surface. Every muscle screamed a protest. His shoulders felt like someone had driven spikes into them, his back ached with a dull, persistent throb, and his raw hands screamed with every movement. The thought of calling in sick, of just rolling over and disappearing under the covers, was a siren song. Just one day, Hank. You earned it. Nobody would blame you. But the red circle on the calendar, rent day, and the faded photograph of Sarah and Emily smiling at him kept his feet on the cold floor. He grimaced, pulling on his work boots, the laces feeling like wire against his stiff fingers. He wouldn't quit. Not today. Day 3 on the demolition site was a blur of sweat and grit. The jackhammer felt heavier, the concrete harder. He pushed through the shaking in his arms, the burning in his chest until his vision swam. He had to lean against a support beam, sucking in ragged breaths, the dust caked on his sweaty face. He looked at the mangled rebar, the splintered wood, and for a wild, fleeting second he almost laughed. This was it. This was him, a broken man breaking more things. He wanted to sit down right there in the debris and just let the whole damn world crumble around him. But then, through the stinging sweat, he saw a foreman watching him, not with judgment, but with a silent, assessing gaze. Hank straightened up, forcing air into his lungs, gripping the jackhammer again. He pressed the trigger. The roar began anew. Days blurred into weeks. The body, stubborn as it was, began to adapt. The raw pain in his hands hardened into calluses that no longer screamed with every grip. His shoulders still ached, but it was a familiar ache, a testament to the work done, not a protest against it. The repetitive clang of metal, the rumble of machinery, the rhythmic thud of the jackhammer, it all started to form a strange kind of symphony, a background hum that filled the empty spaces in his mind. He still woke before dawn, still pulled on the same worn boots, still drove the same route, but somewhere around day 20 something shifted. It wasn't a grand revelation. There was no lightning bolt. It was quieter, like the first trickle of water after a long drought. He noticed the way the morning light caught the dust motes dancing in the air of the half-demolished building, turning them into shimmering, golden particles. He noticed the surprising strength in his forearms as he wrestled a twisted beam into submission. He started to anticipate the next step, not just reacting to orders, but understanding the sequence, the way one section had to come down before the next could safely follow. He found himself picking up a dropped tool for a younger guy without thinking, offering a terse nod when the kid mumbled thanks. The foreman, a grizzled old-timer named Mac, stopped by his section one afternoon not to give orders but just to lean against a wall watching Hank work. "You got a rhythm, Hank," Mac grunted eventually. "Most folks just hit things. You listen to 'em." It was the closest thing to a compliment Hank had heard in years. He just grunted back, but a tiny, almost imperceptible warmth spread through his chest. The grief was still there, a constant companion, but it wasn't screaming in his ears anymore. It was a quieter hum now, like the hum of the city waking up, always present, but no longer paralyzing. Months later, Hank was on a different site, a new build this time. Not tearing down, but putting up. He was a framer now, the work precise, demanding a different kind of strength. His hands, still rough, no longer felt like weapons of destruction, but tools of creation. He could sight down a crooked stud and trim it straight with an effortless economy of motion. He could swing a hammer true, nail after nail sinking with practiced ease. His movements were fluid, deliberate, a quiet ballet of focus and power. He still spoke little, but his eyes, though still carrying the shadow of his past, held a new depth, a quiet certainty. He'd learned to find joy in the clean lines of a well-cut piece of timber, the satisfying thud of a nail driven home, the slow, steady rise of a structure against the sky. His small house, once a meticulously maintained shell, was subtly changing too. He hadn't bought new furniture or painted the walls, but he'd fixed a leaky faucet he'd ignored for years, replaced a broken pane of glass in the kitchen window, even pruned back the overgrown rose bushes that choked the front path. He started cooking simple meals again, not out of necessity, but because the act of chopping vegetables, the smell of garlic sautéing, brought a small, unexpected comfort. He'd even bought a small, sturdy radio for the kitchen, and sometimes, late in the evening, as he cleaned his tools, the low murmur of an old blues tune would fill the quiet air. The loneliness was still there, a deep well within him, but it no longer felt like a bottomless pit. It was a part of him now, like the scars on his hands, a reminder of what he'd lost, but no longer the sum total of who he was. He was building not just structures, but a life, brick by brick, nail by nail, finding purpose in the honest work and the quiet rhythm of his own two hands. Hank would sit on his porch sometimes, after the sun dipped low, and painted the sky in shades he'd never really noticed before. He'd watch the streetlights flicker on, one by one, quiet beacons in the twilight. He'd hold a can of cheap beer, not for the taste so much as for the cool weight in his hand, a small, tangible thing in a world that had once felt so utterly ungraspable. He'd think about the old Hank, the one who measured his worth by the hum of his business, the polish on his truck, the pride in his wife's smile, the laugh of his daughter. He remembered thinking that that was strength. Having it all, keeping it tight, building higher. Funny how a man could be so wrong. He used to chase every nickel, every bid, every contract. He'd lose sleep over market fluctuations, over the price of lumber, over whether a client would pay on time. He thought those worries made him a powerful man, a responsible man. Now his worries were simpler. Did he have enough coffee for the morning? Would his old boots last another winter? Could he still lift that beam without his back protesting too much? And in that simplicity, he found a different kind of power, a bedrock kind of strength. He hadn't gotten Sarah or Emily back. He hadn't rebuilt his business empire or even sought to. The thought of all that chasing, all that climbing just felt empty now. He worked for wages, alongside men who knew their worth by the sweat on their brow and the ache in their bones. He'd share a thermos of coffee on a cold morning, nod in understanding when a younger guy complained about a busted pipe, offer a quiet tip on how to get a stubborn nail out without splintering the wood. He didn't talk about his past much, not the big, devastating parts. But sometimes, a flicker in his eyes, a gentle curve of his lips would tell a story to those who knew how to read it. He'd seen the bottom, and he'd learned that the only thing you could truly lose was the fight in your own heart. Everything else was just stuff, and stuff could be rebuilt or replaced or simply done without. One day, on a job site, he saw a young foreman red-faced and yelling into his phone about a supply shortage. The kid was pacing, frantic, ready to tear his hair out. Hank watched him for a long minute, then walked over, his movements slow and deliberate. "Ain't no use cussin' at a phone, son," Hank said, his voice a low rumble. "That lumber ain't gonna magically appear." The foreman looked up startled, his anger still buzzing around him like a trapped fly. "Easy for you to say, Hank. This whole job's gonna be set back. We're gonna lose money." Hank just nodded, his gaze distant, as if seeing something beyond the immediate frustration. "Yeah, maybe you will, maybe you won't. Thing is," he continued, turning his worn hands over, inspecting the calluses, "you can lose a day, or you can lose a week, or you can lose everything. But what you don't lose if you're smart is your head. You gotta figure out what you can do right now with what you got. That's all there is. Anything else, it ain't real." He didn't wait for a response, just turned and walked back to his saw, the quiet hum of the blade a familiar comfort. The foreman stood there for a moment, then slowly, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in a strange kind of release. He took a deep breath, looked at the unfinished frame around him, and began to make new calls, his voice calmer now, focused. Hank understood now, clearer than the morning sky, what had truly made him strong. It wasn't the sum total of his achievements, his family, his wealth, or his reputation. Those were the things the world gave you, and the world could just as easily take them away. Real strength wasn't about holding on to what you had. It was about standing up when everything had been ripped away, when you were stripped bare, and finding out who you were when you had nothing left but the stubborn beat of your own heart and the will to keep putting one foot in front of the other. It was about the slow, honest work of rebuilding, brick by brick, not for the glory, not for the praise, but just because that's what a man does. He keeps building. He keeps going. And so there was a man. He had lost everything that defined him. His family, his fortune, his good name. He thought he was broken, a hollow shell. But in the quiet, brutal act of picking up the pieces, of finding purpose in the honest work of his own 2 hands, he discovered a strength he never knew he possessed. A strength that didn't depend on what he had, but on what he was made of. A strength that was forged in the fire of loss, durable as the